Welcome everyone to this installment of another lecture in the 2021 lecture series here at the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley in Stanton, Virginia. My name is Doretta Sobolewski. I'm the research coordinator here at the museum, and I am delighted to have today's speaker with me. Here we have Jarrett Chapin. And Jarrett Chapin is a PhD candidate in literary studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interest is 18th and 19th century American literature and 20th century Native American literature. And he's currently in Philadelphia as a Native American Studies Initiative pre-doctoral fellow at the American Philosophical Society. So welcome, Jarrett. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah. So before we get started, could you tell us a little how you got interested in the poetics of contact?
I study literature. So poetics is kind of something that creeps into everything we do. It's hard to talk directly, I suppose, in my field about source texts. So they're always sort of through a matrix of interpretation. I would say, yeah, interpretation is something that the field is interpretation heavy. And so the way I often also look at, and as I'll go into in my talk, I often approach texts as literary texts. And this helps me connect them or helps me engage with source texts and put them into conversation with fiction that I read at the time. So, and I'm actually going to be doing that directly in the first reading of a play written by a military scout about the Ottawa leader Pontiac. So,
yeah, that's going to be very interesting. We deal with primary sources, so I'm going to be curious to see how you look at them from a literary point of view. So if you'd like to get started and share your screen.
Sure. Here we go. Okay. So I've called this lecture a story about stories, or specifically stories of contact. So I thought it would be appropriate to simply start with a good story about contact. On the website of the Lenape, or Delaware Nation, you'll find a story called Give Us a Little Piece of Your Land, which is really two stories that describe early contact between Europeans and Indigenous North Americans. I offer the text from the story, not so that we can engage with it word for word, but so that you can see a fascinating repetition. The line about still being fooled, if you'll see that here, underlined and bolded. That connects each part of the story. The first about the loss of land that focuses on an ox hide, and the second that, I'll argue, is about the loss of culture that focuses on a gift, axe and hoe heads from the European visitors. In the first half of the Delaware chiefs, or in the first half of the story, Delaware chiefs meet Europeans who ask them if they can have some of their land. This is a modest request, as they specify it will only be a parcel the size of an ox hide. And being hospitable, of course, the chiefs consent, at which point the Europeans pull out a prepared hide and cut it into tiny pieces that are used to encircle a very large piece of land. In other versions of the story, and there are other versions, the hide is cut into a mythically thin strip. In the second story, the Delaware are given axe and hoe heads, which they use as ornaments that they string around their necks. Upon seeing this, the Europeans will ask for the tools back so that they can correct their misuse. Attaching wooden handles to the heads, they return the tools to the chiefs so that they can farm and cut wood for houses in the European style. I will call both stories tragedy, not because I wish to impose classical or Western or European frameworks onto them, but because the distinction may help us better understand the stakes of storytelling. For instance, the first story, recording the loss of land, is certainly tragic, as some scholars have read it, and may reflect the infamous colonist fraud perpetrated by Thomas Penn, son of William Penn, in the walking purchase of 1737. The fraud began with the presentation of a deed of sale to Delaware chiefs, which Penn claimed to have discovered. As he claimed, it may have been originally settled between William Penn, widely considered among the tribes of the area to be a fair dealer, and long deceased Delaware chiefs, who in it agreed to the conveyance of land spanning the distance a man could walk through the wooded forest in a day, which might have been anywhere between 10 and 40 miles. I don't personally walk 40 miles in a day. But after the chiefs agreed to uphold the deed, Penn turned it into a colonial era ultra marathon, clearing and flattening a running path that began near present-day Wrightstown on the Delaware River. He then found the fastest runners in the colony and had them assisted by mounted provisioners. All done, this would increase the distance to 70 miles, and after squared up by Penn, produce a cession of about 1.2 million acres. I would argue that the second half of the story about the axe and hoe heads, is a little more difficult to understand, as its content and conclusion may seem to the average American listener to be incompatible. After all, why are colonists being accused of trickery or fooling the Delaware when all they seem to have done is teach the chiefs how to use tools? To cleverly prevent such an unflattering misreading, the storyteller has added the insistence that they are still fooling us, quote unquote. In the earliest accounts of contact, Lenni Lenape people were witnessed wearing necklaces made of copper beads that may have been mined locally, traded, or made from tools or other European trade goods. Overwhelming archaeological evidence attests to the fact that copper objects, most commonly copper beads, were highly valued by Indigenous North Americans in the area of the Delaware homelands since the early woodland period, which is about 1000 BCE. Moreover, colonial observers spanning the eastern seaboard report seeing indigenous jewelry made from fragments of tools or other metal European goods that may have raised the status of their wearers. Therefore, viewed or interpreted from a worldview that may not be Delaware, but is at any rate not colonialist, the story about axes and hoe heads becomes a tragedy, just like the oxhide story. However, the story of the tool heads is about the loss of culture. It's a loss brought on by a mistaken trust in European culture. This is meant to illustrate a core concept in this talk, in which we'll be looking at the normative context, or the worldview, as I will call it, that gives meaning to stories. Fans of classical literature, or perhaps just folklorists familiar with the oxhide story, might recognize echoes of the founding of Carthage in the first story that I told, in which Dido, fleeing her brother with an entourage of those loyal to her, comes upon the realm of Eobarbus, who considers her and her followers, or who offers her and her followers land to rest that is no larger than an ox head or ox hide. Cleverly, Dido cuts the hide into small pieces and encircles a hill that will be called Bursa, which means hide, the future site of Carthage. The story is told as an epic romance in which Dido uses her prodigious cunning to outwit a miserly king. And from Eobarbus's perspective, it's important to note, this is certainly a tragedy in which, like the Lenni Lenape, he has been defrauded of land in his kingdom. So why am I mixing up modes of fiction with history in this way? Why use narrow literary forms like tragedy or romance or comedy? There are a couple of reasons. First is because we can. As long as we accept the claim that all stories, whether they are meant to be fiction or nonfiction, have an ineluctably poetic nature. That is, all good stories have a structure that makes their events entertaining to us, and more than mere chronicle, which would be a long, shapeless enumeration of events. All stories, for instance, have a beginning, a middle, and an end, as I've diagrammed here. We'll call this implotment, or the idea that events in all stories are inevitably made to be entertaining or engaging in some way. And this will mean that they can be recognized as a certain kind of literary or through a certain kind of literary mode. If we apply this to the Delaware story, we can plot the beginning during which the Delaware are perhaps in a state of ignorance about European trickery, the middle in which they commit to an action, here letting an ox-hide-sized piece of land go, which turns out to be a deception, and the end, marked by the loss of Delaware land. So said differently, history and literature can be compared or read into each other, and that can be illuminating. Second, the larger point of this talk is that this kind of interpretation can help to identify or clarify and even reveal biases in historical writing in which the experiences of groups from different cultural contexts are described. I do not intend to argue for the superiority of one mode over the other with regard to the representation of Indigenous interaction, but merely to suggest that being unaware of these structures and biases could result in their unwitting duplication. This in turn could result in confusion or political paralysis, for instance, for groups of people they purport to describe. Now, just a brief note before I move on. In the following, I'm going to be looking at just 3 literary modes. First, tragedy, which teaches its audience about the consequences of transgression. Romance, which often demonizes other people who must be conquered. And comedy, which portrays the production of new communities out of a state of confusion. This is not meant to be exhaustive or an exhaustive list of literary modes in any way. In fact, it will not even prove to be an exhaustive account of each individual mode. And I know people can talk at length about literary modes like romance, for instance, a fairly mercurial concept. However, I think this lecture should suffice for an introduction to literary patterns and stories of Indigenous and colonist contact. I've begun and will proceed with tragedy because I think it offers the richest examples of contrasting worldviews, owing possibly to tragedy's particularly moralistic character, which is associated with the idea of transgression and punishment. In this way, tragedy is often very palpable. And I don't want my story also to end with tragedy, because we have to remember that I'm also plotting my own story here. Typically, tragedy is meant to produce a particular kind of edification for listeners or audience members who, in witnessing the hero's fall, are shocked and terrified into having what has been described as an epiphany of law. As Aristotle wrote, tragedy is the imitation of an action. An action implies personal agents who necessarily possess certain distinctive qualities, both of character and thought. For it is by these that we qualify actions themselves, and these, thought and character, are the 2 natural causes from which actions spring, and on actions, again, all success or failure depends. The Aristotelian formula, at least part of it, looks like this diagram below, in which tragic failure is caused by something that is part of the hero's character. When the hero performs the fated action, the fall or undesirable outcome can be tied to the hero's action, but also to the heroes themselves or their character. Unaware or blinded by confidence, which would be hybris or hubris, the hero will choose a path in life that leads to annihilation while spectators watch and cringe. This cringing could more or less be associated with the phenomenon called catharsis. Said differently, the choice of the tragic hero becomes a crime that will be punished as a matter of social or natural course. And the nature of that transgression can only be understood through the discovery of the law that underwrites it. For instance, we might reflect on the deaths of Romeo and Juliet as punishment for the crimes of their families, brought about, of course, by their immaturity, which we imagine to be the larger machine in which they have thrown a switch. As I will show, accounts like this take for granted the jurisdictions, or as I have been calling them for the sake of simplicity, the worldviews, in which certain actions can be described as transgressions or crimes. That said, in tragedy as well as romance and comedy, we will be searching for the worldviews that authorize these stories, authorizing crimes in tragedy quests as quests in romance, and misunderstandings as misunderstandings in comedy. And one way, by the way, to think about this, and I do like Hayden White mentions a sort of the tragedy compared to romance. Tragedy is being crushed by the world. Romance is crushing the world. It's a very effective description, I think. But I'm going to start with a story of Pontiac's rebellion because it's been told or retold enough such that it provides a powerful comparison of fiction and nonfiction sources, both sitting on contrasting worldviews. We'll look at two sources, a play and a work of modern history, to see how they grapple with the story of Pontiac. Pontiac, and it's given a kind of sibilant thing, Pontiach or Pontiac, however you want to say it, was written in 1766 by the British military scout Robert Rogers. There, Rogers recounted the rise and fall of Pontiac's rebellion, a pan-Indian assault on British forts and soldiers thought to be orchestrated by the Ottawa war chief, Pontiac. Modeled on Roman tragedy, Rogers's play transforms Pontiac into a tragic hero who rallies his allies through examples of oratorical persuasion that 17th and 18th century colonists often associated with indigenous consensus-driven governance. In the play, Pontiac loses the war owing to the centrality of reciprocity in indigenous communities. That is, when the customs of indigenous society, as Rogers understood them, cut the other way, and his men wander off the field, having not received any compensation for their services. Pontiac laments, when men expect their bounties in return, place them in want, destroy the giving power, all sacrifices and regards will cease. Before we understand this as a tragedy belonging to a certain worldview, we must unpack the scene and work through a brief explanation of what scholars have called systems of reciprocity that are often associated with the concept of the gift. The gift was an exchange of goods and services that could sustain the authority of tribal leaders as well as social relations throughout indigenous communities. Here referring to those in the northeastern quadrant of North America. According to European observers reporting primarily on Algonquin-speaking communities who occupied the leading edge of European contact, the exchange or redistribution of goods constituted the backbone of indigenous social order. Among the highest authorities in tribal life, civil chiefs were talented negotiators charged with making important community decisions and negotiating with groups outside of the community. Inside their communities, they maintained that authority through a combination of diplomatic competence and the redistribution of goods to their constituents. As one French observer noted, the influence of chiefs depended upon how much they exerted and upon their attention to keeping their warriors' kettles full, so to say. And this could be also leaning towards the description of war chiefs, which is something different, which is actually what Pontiac was. But the concept remains the same here, but seems to be mentioning warriors. The logic of the gift extended to diplomatic relations between indigenous and European communities, as the European bestowal of goods would often open frontier negotiations as signs of goodwill or compensation for recent acts of violence and loss. In the eyes of some colonists, such as Rogers perhaps, performances of reciprocity were nothing but examples of bribery, representative of the chaotic ordering of indigenous society. General Jeffrey Amherst was no fan, for instance, of the gift system. And after he led the British forces to victory in the 7 Years' War, he worked to put an end to it. The 7 Years' War of the French and Indian War, or the French and Indian War, as it was known in the colonies, concluded with the withdrawal of French military forces from the area of the Ohio River Valley to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, leaving former French allies, largely Algonquin-speaking communities, at the mercy of ungenerous British trading partners. The French had spent lavishly on diplomacy and the gift system, and with them gone, their former partners would need to go to their enemies who now held the monopoly on trade in the area. Following British victory, Amherst saw the opportunity to dictate harsher diplomatic terms, which included the discontinuation of the gift system, which he saw as nothing but bribery. As he wrote in a 1760 letter to William Johnson, purchasing the good behavior, either of Indians or any others, is what I do not understand. When men of what race soever behave ill, they must be punished, but not bribed. In curtailing gifts, limiting trade, and placing a cap on the sale of gunpowder, Amherst aimed at reducing Indigenous North Americans to a state of subsistence hunting as a means of keeping them off the warpath and focused on finding their next meal. The result, in combination with various other harms committed by emboldened British subjects, was the pan-Indian uprising called Pontiac's Rebellion, which involved the systematic siege and capture of almost every British fort in the colony's northeastern quadrant. The siege would end with stalemate as British trade was halted with the occupation of British forts. The siege would end, or rather every victory over Indigenous combatants, already costly in men and arms, also added to the economic hardship of losing those combatants as valuable trade partners. By contrast, the strength of Indigenous forces gained with the seizure of every fort. Yet occupying the forts was not practical, and many of the Indigenous participants still had homesteads to tend and were preparing to leave for the hunt. The facts of the rise and fall of Pontiac's rebellion only loosely coincide with Rogers's portrayal, which replaces the practical necessity of seasonal subsistence hunting with the idea that Pontiac could not keep his troops on the field because of the voluntarism and norms of reciprocity inherent in Algonquin social and military organization. Rogers, a British major, was a military man who began his service in the New Hampshire backwoods at the age of 15 and worked his way up through the ranks. He is sometimes credited with the invention of the American Special Forces, which makes histories of Rogers kind of a cottage industry, I think, among hobbyists. Subsequently, his tragedy concludes with the idea that Pontiac failed because, unlike the British, Indigenous society was inherently disorganized and lacked the regimented discipline and hierarchical organization that was commonplace in British military operations, and by extension, British society. In the words of Pontiac's fictional advisor at the site of his routed troops, all is disorder, tumult, and rebellion. Notice Rogers's linking of the name of the event, rebellion, with the name of its undoing, disorder. Defeated, Pontiac is one of the first Indians to acknowledge his position and walk off into the distant woods. The real tragedy of Pontiac, as told in modern history, began at the end of the uprising and resembled to a large extent the Lenape tragedy described at the beginning of my talk, that is with regard to its connection to a worldview. That is, the worldview that makes it meaningful is an Indigenous one, or at least one based on a charitable perception of Indigenous society. Pontiac's tragedy was set in motion when British officials wrote the Ottawa Leader and proposed peace negotiations, promising that Pontiac would become the most powerful man in the region. He took the British up on their offer and was thereafter described by English writers, Rogers in particular, as King or Emperor Pontiac. Rogers, in fact, would use the grandiose title in his nonfiction accounts where he raised the status of Pontiac in order to raise his own, kind of like John Smith would do with Pocahontas, and claimed that they were acquaintances. King or emperor both represented concepts foreign to Indigenous systems of governance, not to mention a considerable promotion, as Pontiac had only begun as a war chief, or a chief that serves primarily a military function in Algonquin societies. He notably lacked the rank or authority of a civil chief, much less the experience or wisdom that accompanied the title. Over the coming year, Pontiac, now an emperor among the British, would make the fatal mistake of acting the part, as he began to speak in a tone that was utterly at odds with Algonquin understandings of leadership and subordination, writes Richard White. For this transgression, Pontiac would carry a price on his head, and would soon after be bludgeoned and stabbed to death by a Peoria chief in the French village of Cahokia. The modern historian Richard White describes the episode as tragedy and Pontiac's death as a monument to the limits of chieftainship. To review, Rogers described Pontiac's crime as not his alone, but that of his people, who are tried and found guilty in accordance with the British worldview. By contrast, Pontiac's crime in White's telling of the tragedy can only be meaningful in an indigenous jurisdiction or worldview, wherein Pontiac was essentially found guilty of pretending to be British. Now, while tragedy offers us epiphanies of law, romance, I'd argue, offers us epiphanies of politics. As the image of the enemy, representatives of an awful world are represented in a black and white universe of good and evil. In the chivalric romance, depictions of villains call to the audience for righteous violence, and the worldview of the author and reader are carried by the hero who struggles against evil towards triumphal resolution. In this way, the romantic formula is fairly simple and also, unfortunately, familiar. It should therefore be no surprise that it provided the frame for the very first examples of colonist writing, producing images of the dark frontier wilderness and transforming that into a blocking figure or obstacle between superhumanly pious Puritan heroes and their holy mission to demonstrate the validity of the Reformation. As such, North American Indians were converted into the devil incarnate, or merely the demonic instruments of Satan, parts of a whole that needed to be beaten back and replaced with Christian cities. Like tragedy and its use of emerging information about indigenous cultures, romance was also transformed by contact and colonization, which had the effect of circuitously linking the quest object to the possession of land. While more common in the earliest adventuring stage of colonization, romantic emplotment is often a motif or minor pattern in the criticism of modern historical works, and a number of scholars have labored to examine the symbolic treatment of the female body. For instance, in early accounts of colonization in Mesoamerica and colonial North America. Largely, these scholars have described the romance of colonization as a triangulation between hero colonists and the men and women of the land, such that, as historian Camilla Townsend notes, taking an Indian woman, one took a continent, metaphorically speaking. An early example comes from the Spanish castaway Juan Ortiz, who related the story of how he had come to live among indigenous groups in the area of present-day Tampa, Florida. Structurally, Ortiz's story imitates and creates a model for other stories of colonial romance in which the prodigious courage or endurance of the typical romantic hero is replaced with the prodigious spiritual superiority and/or physical attractiveness of colonists. Numerous historians have noted this pattern of colonist self-description that places women, specifically indigenous women, in a central narrative role. Ortiz's story was recorded in one of several chronicles of the Desoto Expedition through North America, this one attributed to a gentleman of Elvas. He would join Desoto as his translator and perish like Desoto in the Arkansas River Valley. The story of Ortiz's captivity gained a wider dissemination among English readers when it was added in translation to Richard Hakluyt's 1609 Virginia Richly Valued. In his account, Ortiz claims that he had originally been a captive of Ucita, where the chief there determined immediately and without explanation to execute him. He would be saved by the chief's daughter, who desired that he would not put him to death. The chief allegedly gave Ortiz the duty of guarding a temple from wild animals, which he did for 3 years until the village was attacked by the chief called Makoko, from the town that may have had the same name. Moving to another location, the chief of Ucita again decided to kill Ortiz in order to seek supernatural guidance. And again, the chief's daughter, who we might suggestively call the Princess of Yusta, intervened, telling Ortiz of the plan and helping him to escape in the night to the town of her father's rival, where Desoto would find him 12 years later. Among its other qualities, one important element of the romantic mode is wish fulfillment. The hero of romance is often a condensation of community values, and the quest object represents something desirable. Blocking characters may intervene only to be finally vanquished. Ortiz's Yucita chief is just such a character who, wielding the threat of unprovoked violence, seems to call on readers of the account to intervene. In their places, a moral figure and the object of desire, the Yucita chief's daughter, emerges to spare Ortiz her father's capricious wrath, thereby showing herself to be worthy of our admiration and, importantly, different from her people, who are actually described as devil worshippers in the account, who sacrifice their own to their dark master, who talks to them and telleth them that he is athirst and willeth them to sacrifice unto him. Contradicting her devilish father, the chief's daughter, like the indigenous women of similar stories before and after, is notably a candidate for Christian conversion. And as it would be in other romantic histories, notably the adventures of Hernan Cortez in Mexico, she appears as a deserving inheritor of her homelands. And this is where the connection or the triangulation comes into effect. As readers would have assumed, and the text actively suggests, the attention of the Yucita chief's daughter was probably not wholly innocent, and her petition to spare his life was probably owing to her attraction, perhaps to his moral superiority. Though Ortiz died miserably on Desoto's expedition, had this union been solemnized, he might have found himself, readers could fantasize, an important proprietor in Florida. Richard Hakluyt's collections of English and Spanish exploration stories offered a compendium of adventure for readers, particularly young men who could enjoy the conversion of danger and mystery in foreign lands into a pleasurable adventure. Moreover, the stories of compliant and scantily clothed indigenous women who seemed to favor Europeans over their own indigenous men would have also been presumably appealing. Captain John Smith of Jamestown was certainly a part of this readership. In fact, Hakluyt's edited editions may have created his initial inspiration to seek a life of adventure in Europe and the New World. On this note, a number of historians suggest that Hakluyt's later 1609 publication, Virginia Richly Valued, which again included the Ortiz story, may have inspired Smith to write the story that gave him his enduring claim to fame. The story of Pocahontas and her rescue of the captive Smith from her father, Powhatan's executioner. The parallels are far too close to deny it out of hand, and the history of Smith's publications seem to support this theory. In fact, a version of Ortiz's story appears several times in Smith's later writings, wherein Smith is stranded or captured, his life is threatened by a man of the country, and he is liberated by a woman of the country. Perhaps testing out the waters to see how it lands, Smith included a version of Ortiz's second rescue in a 1616 letter written to Queen Anne on the methods of Powhatan and Pocahontas's feelings towards the English, of her father's designs and Pocahontas's feeling he did not know. But of this I am sure, he said, when her father, with the utmost of his policy and power, sought to surprise me, having but 18 with me, the dark night could not affright her from coming through the irksome woods, and with watered eyes gave me intelligence, with her best advice, to escape his fury. Had he known, he had surely slain her. In later works, Smith included the formula in which ladies from Turkey, Russia, and France, Shiratza, Kalamata, and Madame Chanois, respectively, all save his life because they find him irresistible. Stories such as this still resemble the quest in which knights errant of exceptional talent and endurance and morality seek power or paradise in grails and princesses who are captivated by dark and brooding monsters. Yet, in the colonial context, the princesses become indigenous women who are again transformed into symbolic acts of possession. Likewise, the dark and brooding monsters of an uncaring world become indigenous men who must stand as repositories of indigenous culture or an indigenous world. In this way, colonial romance is partly summed up by one memorable description of the colonial relationship formulated by the post-colonial scholar Gayatri Spivak, namely that white men are saving brown women from brown men. Given the prodigious attractiveness of European men, violence is here partly unnecessary, though it will be justified given the Manichaean or binarizing good and evil work of romance. Structurally, like romance, comedy involves a hero, a goal or object of desire, and a blocking figure who fosters misunderstanding. Comedy also imagines a struggle towards some desired object through a harsh or confusing world. Yet, unlike romance, the comic mode accomplishes resolution through reconciliation rather than violent or cunning conquest or triumph. For instance, Shakespeare's 1598 Much Ado About Nothing revolves around misperception produced by rumors or noting, which block the union of two couples who reconcile in various episodes of Discovery. Discovery is very important to this. Somewhat representative of the mode and its use of disguise in Discovery, the plot is first complicated and then uncomplicated in a masquerade ball. At the conclusion of the play, the lovers at its center are united when one presumed dead removes her disguise. Much Ado resolves in marriage, which, like other comedies, represents the creation of one worldview from two formerly in opposition or tattered by confusion and misunderstanding. Quite unfunny, but nonetheless comical structurally, is the story of the 1682 robbery and murder of two Frenchmen on the Keweenaw Peninsula in Lake Superior, an area that in the late 17th century was thrown into chaos. Intertribal fighting had reached a high point, and Europeans there, who had nearly created a situation by creating intense trade rivalries, were often sucked into the violence. As Richard White notes, these indigenous acts of robbery and violence may have aimed at disrupting European trade with other tribes. Amid the violence, these acts might have also been simple retaliation. Hearing of the crime, the French explorer and interested intermediary, Daniel Greysolon, Duluth, pressed for a particularly European notion of justice, ordering the murderers apprehended. A headman from a tribe on the Keweenaw, Akiganaga, his two sons, and a Menominee man from Green Bay. The result was a clash in negotiation between indigenous and French notions of justice. In custody, the accused group was to be tried by a jury and executed, but the result was very different, and I argue, structurally comic. The Indians were assembled by Duluth to reflect the organization of a European legal trial. Ottawa, Chippewa, and Huron Petun bands were gathered into a jury, and the kinsmen of Akiganaga and his party were transformed into legal counsel. As White writes, the indigenous participants of this strange ceremony were compliant given their status as allies, but also because of the turmoil in the area, which fed the fear among indigenous as well as European communities that any insult might tip the scales of peace and produce a new bloody conflict between them. Duluth's insistence on a trial reflected his commitment to a European worldview in which justice depended on determinations of guilt and commensurate punishment. He therefore demanded the death for all the parties responsible. Indigenous justice was different and perhaps better suited to the chaotic environment in which the killing took place. Most often, proper indigenous responses to such killing would involve actions that maintained social harmony. As the crime had been committed by perpetrators who were allies, the proper custom among the indigenous groups assembled would have to be to cover, would have been to cover the graves or raise the dead by offering compensation to the family of the victims, not execution, which was reserved only for enemy perpetrators. Duluth claimed later in a letter to Governor Lefebvre de la Barre that members of the accused party had offered slaves to raise the dead for the French, though the arresting official under Duluth's guidance refused this, remarking that 100 slaves and 100 packages of beaver could not make him traffic in the blood of brothers. The sons of Akiganaga and the Menominee man confessed, but Akiganaga pled not guilty, and perhaps because of his station, was excused from the proceedings. Given the delicacy of the situation, Duluth was instructed that he ought not to execute the group, as it would create, or it would certainly create more violence in the backcountry for settlers who were living there. This advice he took to mean that he could not, however, execute the whole group. Rather, Duluth sought a way of appealing to indigenous norms and settled on lex talionis, or an eye for an eye. Though it was reserved only for enemy offenders, he reasoned that killing 2 men for 2 men murdered Akiganaga's eldest son and the Menominee man, rather than the whole party, would be a way of finding common ground with indigenous custom. The grounds for Duluth's capital punishment were still unsteady, however, until an Amiquas headman named Omamens offered a ceremonious speech that emphasized Duluth's actions and conformed to Algonquin customs. He praised Duluth for his merciful sparing of one of Akiganaga's sons when he might have killed both. With this gesture, 2 men were finally executed, which indeed threatened the delicate peace in the area. The execution was perceived widely as 2 more murders that needed resolution. Because Akiganaga's sons and the Menominee man had been executed in the territory of the allied groups in the area, they were implicated also in his death and also worried about retaliation. For this reason, they offered 2 wampum belts to the French to cover the graves of the first 2 murdered Frenchmen, 2 other belts to Akiganaga, and 2 to the Menominee's relatives. So that would be 6 belts in total. Duluth, for his part, held a feast for the headman whose cabin had been used to host the fateful trial, and thereat loaded Akiganaga with presents, essentially covering the graves at the end of it all. While this story ends with the performance of indigenous custom, it nonetheless concludes in reconciliation through the combination of perspectives. Indigenous onlookers had loosened their distinction between punishments for friends and enemies, and the French had compromised on wholesale punishment and guilt, deferring to a slightly distorted version of European justice. Despite such reconciliations, the course of this history, traced by White again, ends in tragedy as what he calls the middle ground, or mutual tendency to search for compromise under the threat of violence, deteriorated and disappeared finally in the 19th century. However, before that time, we might imagine that indigenous North Americans inhabited a new world formed from the confusion of the two. In my final example, I draw on the darker history of indigenous life in the American Southwest, which included violent raiding and slave exchange driven by colonial market forces following the settlement of colonists in the 16th century. As scholars note, the demand for slaves in this area came not only from colonist markets, but from cultural adaptations that produced social structures premised on the production of goods and the maintenance of social status in tribes. These structures demanded slaves, following their abduction and cultural indoctrination, provided labor, produced offspring, who provided labor, produced offspring, and became raiders themselves in what has been described as a coherent and self-perpetuating social structure fueled largely by violence and raiding. In this violent landscape, captives who had been torn away from their communities to which they were born were forced to adapt to the cultures of their enemies, becoming valuable cultural intermediaries and shaping larger developments in the colonial contest between indigenous and Europeans, vying for control of the West. According to James Brooks, in his monograph, Captives and Cousins, a new stage of Comanche politics emerged in the 1780s, when Comanche communities began to seek treaty-based dealings with a European power. This sudden turn to trade likely owed to the recent alliance of rivals, the Sioux and Cheyenne, who had been supplied with arms by their new American allies. And though like-minded Comanche leaders had begun to oust their leaders who had sought personal power and prestige at the expense of trade relations with other communities, initiating the discussion about peace, about this new era of trade-dependent communication, was nevertheless fraught, owing to years of violent conflict with Spanish colonists, among others. It was different, or rather, the negotiations were difficult to approach. As Brooks notes, the area of trade began with a fortuitous misunderstanding in which an Indian captive of the Spanish named Jose Chiquito, separated from his hunting party, was taken prisoner by the spies of Equiracapa, one of the new leadership who sought trade and diplomacy over prestige-driven violence. Mistaking Chiquito for a member of the, an enemy soldier or a member of an enemy tribe, owing to his dress, he was actually costumed as such. The spies presumably planned to take him captive. However, after revealing himself to be a captive of the Spanish, to whom Equiracapa wished to speak, he was taken to Equiracapa's settlement. Comically, in a structural sense, Chiquito's return to his masters following the discovery of his true identity would serve as the pretense for peace talks or union between indigenous and European communities. More troubling, but similarly imploded in the comic mode by Brooks, is the story of the 1680 abduction by Navajo raiders of Captain Andres Hurtado's daughters, both named Juana, and his 2-year-old granddaughter from his settlement in the Jaimes River, or on the Jaimes River. Redeemed by their brother, Brooks attributes the fairly prosperous lives these captives enjoyed following their captivity to their valuable roles as cultural intermediaries formed in captivity. The eldest Juana, for instance, enjoyed various liaisons with high-ranking Spanish officials and gave birth to 7 children by at least 4 different husbands, seemingly without suffering any social stigma. Her sister, Juana, whose mother, a Zia Pueblo woman who had probably been raped by Andres Hurtado, was much more prosperous, dying in her 80s, a wealthy proprietor of 2 rancheros and an incredible amount of livestock. While both Hurtado's daughters were presumably valuable cultural intermediaries in Spanish society, his mixed-race daughter was more prosperous owing to her deeper cultural and linguistic connections, which gave her a rare prestige among the Navajo people who would come to visit her throughout her life. As Brooks argues, Juana became a hub for intercultural dealing, a human bridge, quote unquote, across 3 cultures. I end with stories from Brooks's book, which you might have noticed, have here identified more closely with their author, for 2 reasons. First, I perceive in his opening chapter and his performance in subsequent chapters a conscious effort to write in the comic mode. It may not be so important that Brooks self-consciously writes this way, though he does make several, albeit casual, mentions of romance and tragedy in his opening chapter. Second, and much more important, are the deleterious effects that his approach may produce, according to one reading of it. Rather, it is possible that using stories of violence, rape, and human bondage as instances of reconciliation or community formation may appear inappropriate to some readers. Western Shoshone historian Ned Blackhawk, for instance, criticizes Brooks's tendency to perpetuate essentialisms, minimize colonial violence, downplay the trauma of enslavement, and effectively deform the effects of colonialism through the thesis that such effects are secondary to the production of cultural exchange and community. It's worth noting here that in his own book, which I will not have time to examine in full here, Black Hawk links physical, emotional, and symbolic violence to assemble what is essentially a tragic story, interestingly enough, about the way colonization created a lasting legacy of trauma among the peoples of North America. So briefly, by reading 3 modes of implantment through a very limited handful of works in the foregoing, I again do not intend to present the claim that any one of these modes is superior to the other, but to show hopefully that they're all flexible with regard to their points of emphasis and effects. In fact, there are certainly other modes of implantment that I have not explored here and that I have not even considered with regard to their literary effects or use of different scholarly ends. I can think of, for instance, like epic and satire. Also, my intention has been mostly descriptive rather than prescriptive, as I see the reading of literary modes and historical accounts to be a useful indicator of bias with regard to the representation of indigenous and colonist interaction in works, both past and present. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much for your lecture. I think we have time for one question. You did mention authors as well. So when we look here at the museum, when we do primary source research, when we look at historical documents, we look at the context, of course, and also who's the author, what time period was it written, and of course you do that as well. But when you analyze fiction, sometimes that's a little more difficult. So I just wonder, since you're looking at historical records, you also look at some historical pieces of fiction as well. Do you have a different approach on how you frame these documents, how you approach them in regard to author's intention or the purpose of the particular sources? If you could explain, if you go into a little into your process, that'd be great.
What's interesting about, and I can use Rogers's text as an example, perhaps, because that, so what's fascinating when I look at fiction, I find that often the intentions, or rather, it's rather easy to align the intentions of the authors of fiction with their intentions if, for instance, they write nonfiction accounts. Rogers himself, he had various intentions. A lot of them were self-serving, actually, so he's a little bit different in this regard. But as his larger intention for authoring three works, he published his journals, and he published a kind of, I would say just like an account, he calls it a concise account. But it's kind of like a guidebook to North America. He published this around the same time that he published his play. And his intention in that was to appear like an expert, basically. And so he was attempting to get a promotion to the role of commandant of a fort. He had a dream that he was going to create a trade empire. And he did get his appointment, so it worked. Apparently, he was stationed at Fort Michilimackinac for a very short time before he was brought up on charges of treason. Apparently, so what's fascinating about Rogers's sort of complex of works is he's looking for a promotion, but also his audience is important, and it's always obviously audience is always important. And so he's not addressing just anyone, he's addressing the crown, because this is where he gets, this is where he's going to get his promotion. And so it's fascinating actually, because he'll actually produce source documents that other people will look back on. But they won't often look at the play, it's a terrible play. It's really awful. But he draws a lot of the content. There's sort of communication between the two. And so he, in his play, the reason he'll represent his indigenous people, at least I argue, he applies a kind of Hobbesian theory What his argument is, if you can say a literary work has an argument, his play essentially argues that indigenous people can't get justice because colonists are murdering them. And this justice is framed in terms of an absent king. Okay, so they need a king, is what he's arguing essentially. And also, there's a lot of actually, there's a search for sovereignty. Lauren Benton writes about sovereignty and how it sort of like is mediated by geographies. And this is definitely something that's sort of going on here. He's arguing through a kind of a bias that exists at the time that when you send colonists further away from the metropole, they begin to act like savages, you know. And so his argument is essentially that the New World needs a reconquest, or the New World needs a reformation. I would place Rogers's text with, for instance, Dryden's Reformation plays that do kind of the same thing. It actually, they sort of use like what you would call Indian costume to depict British people without a king as savages in Mesoamerica. Or they're called his American plays. So in that sense, yes, I would look quite a bit to context in where that's coming from. But also, as I hope that I've demonstrated, there's quite a bit to get from just sort of sometimes I feel like you can start with what's going on in the text and then better understand what's going on in the context rather than approaching, it may seem less responsible to some people, but if what you have is a tragedy that makes an argument that indigenous people fail in the universe for some reason just because they're indigenous, there's something going on, right? So that's, I suppose that's how I would, yeah.
Very interesting. If any of our viewers have any more questions for you, what would be the best way for them to contact you?
They can shoot an email to me at jechapin@gmail.com. I'd be happy to take any recommendations or criticisms or anything like that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we'll make sure we include your email address and on our website as well. So thank you so much once again. Good luck with your PhD research and your fellowship at the American Philosophical Society. And thank you to our viewers. Let us know if you like this lecture. Send us an email. Also, if you enjoy programs like the lecture series, please consider making a donation. There's a donate button on the bottom left of our website. And I want to thank the American Frontier Culture Foundation for supporting this lecture series. So thanks everyone again, and hopefully we'll see you at the next lecture. Bye.